The Outdoor Girls in Florida by Laura Lee Hope. Chapter 9. On a Sandbar. "Alligators!" screamed Amy. "Don't you dare say that, Grace." "But it's so. I saw one. I nearly put my hand on his big black head. Oh, isn't it horrid?" Grace and Amy were clinging to each other now in the middle of the boat. Betty had turned about at their exclamations, and Molly was gazing curiously into the swirling water. "I don't see any alligator," she announced unbelievingly. "Are you sure you saw one, Grace?" "Of course I am. Oh, Betty, there's one now just ahead of you. You're going to run into him." Betty turned her attention to guiding the boat only just in time. Certainly something long and knobby and black was almost at the bow. She veered to one side and then exclaimed, "Alligator! That was nothing but a log. Grace Ford, how silly of you!" "Silly? Nothing of the sort. I tell you I did see an alligator." "It was a log, but it does look like one of the big creatures, though," said Amy. "Oh, if it should have been one!" "Well, it couldn't eat us here in the boat," said Molly. "No, but it might have capsized us, and then—" Grace paused suggestively. "All's well that ends well," quoted Betty, as she turned the boat nearer shore. "Some day we must take our lunch and have a picnic ashore. See the lovely Spanish moss hanging down from the trees? It's like living history over again. Just think of it, how Balboa came here and discovered the land, and it wasn't Balboa. It was Ponce de Leon who located Florida," corrected Molly. "Don't you remember Flowery Easter?" "Oh, so it was. Well, anyhow—" "There! There!" screamed Grace. "There's an alligator, surely. It's alive, too. Oh, dear, an alligator!" She pointed to something long and dark floating in the river, something that seemed to be covered with scales and ridges, something that suddenly turned up an ugly head, and with bulging eyes, which looked fishily at the girls in the boat. Then, with a swirl of its tail, the creature sank below the surface. "Yes, that was an alligator," said Betty quietly. "I told you it was," spoke Grace. "And to think I nearly had my hand on it. Oh, I don't want to remember it." "But it didn't bite you," said practical Molly. "If it had, well, the less said the better," remarked Betty. "Now let's forget all about it and enjoy ourselves. Maybe there are only a few of them here in the river." "I wonder what alligators are good for, anyhow," came from Amy as she resumed her seat. "They don't seem fit for anything." "You forget about alligator bags," corrected Molly. "What would we do for valises and satchels if we had no alligators, I'd like to know." "That's so," admitted Amy. Grace was looking over the surface of the river as though to see if any more of the ugly creatures were in sight, but the water was unruffled, saved by the wind. Not knowing the character of the stream, Betty did not want to venture too far. So after going down about a mile or so, she turned the boat and headed upstream. They passed a number of small boats manned by colored boys who were fishing, and the youngsters suspended operations to gaze with mingled wonder and fear at Betty's swiftly moving craft. They tied up at the small dock, which extended out into the river at the foot of the orange grove, well satisfied with their first trip, even though they had been frightened by the alligators. "Yes, you will find one or two gators now and then," said Mr. Hammond, the overseer, when told of the girls' experience. "But they won't bother you, especially in a big boat. Don't worry." But Grace was so nervous that night that she did not sleep well, and Mrs. Stonington grew quite alarmed. Perhaps it was as much worry over the fate of Will as the recollection of her escape from the alligator that disturbed Grace. For no good news had come from Mr. Ford. He had set many influences at work on the case, but so far nothing had come of his inquiries. Will seemed to have been taken into the interior of Florida and there lost. There were so many turpentine camps, or places where contract labor was used to get out valuable wood or other products, that a complete inquiry would take a long time. Mrs. Ford was as well as could be expected. Grace's father wrote, though naturally very much worried. And Grace was worried, too. If she could have engaged actively in a search for her brother, perhaps she might not have fretted so. But it was harassing to sit idly by and let others do the work. "Especially when we have already done so much," said Betty, agreeing with her chum's view of the case. Watching the work of gathering oranges, occasionally themselves helping somewhat, taking walks, drives, and trips in the motorboat made time for the girls pass quickly. Then, one day, Betty said, "Girls, we must go on a picnic. Take our lunch and go down the river in the boat. Go ashore and eat. We will do some exploring." "And perhaps find the fountain of youth that Ponce de Leon missed," added Molly. "If you bring it, bring some of the water back," begged Mr. Stonington. "You girls will not need it. I do." "We'll bottle some for you," promised Amy, laughing. Soon they were off in the Gem again, Grace at least keeping a wary eye out for alligators. But they saw none of the unprepossessing creatures. "Though perhaps we may meet with a sea cow," suggested Betty, as she looked for a pleasant place whereon to go ashore for lunch. "What's a sea cow?" asked Molly. "One that eats seaweed," cried Amy. "No, I mean a manatee," went on Betty. "Don't you remember the big creatures we saw in the New York Aquarium a year or so ago?" "Oh, yes!" exclaimed Amy. "Well, they're not as bad as alligators. At least they haven't such large mouths." "And they only eat grass," added Molly. Betty was sending her boat ahead at good speed, scanning the shores of the river for some quiet cove into which to steer. The day was warm, and the sun shone down unclouded. From the banks came the odor of flowers. Suddenly, as the boat chugged along, there came a momentary halt, as though it had struck something. "What's that?" cried Grace. "Maybe an alligator has us," suggested Molly with a laugh, for the Gem went on as though nothing had happened. "Don't be silly," chided Grace. "It was certainly something." Betty looked back a bit nervously and glanced at the engine. "I hope the gasoline isn't giving out," she murmured. "The idea!" cried Grace. Then, with a shock that threw all the girls forward in their seats, the Gem came to a sudden halt, and the engine raced furiously. Betty at once shut off the power. "Oh, oh!" cried Grace. "What is it? Has an alligator got hold of us?" Betty looked over the bow. Then she said grimly, "We've run on a sandbar, that's all. Run on it good and hard, too. I wonder if we can get off." End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Outdoor Girls in Florida by Laura Lee Hope. Chapter 10. Doubtful Help. Betty's words caused her three chums to stare at her in wonder. Then, by glancing over the side of the boat themselves, they confirmed what she had said. A sandbar," faltered Grace, sinking back among some cushions that matched her dress wonderfully well. Molly said later that Grace always tried to match something, even if it was only her chocolates. "A plain, ordinary sandbar," repeated Betty. "One of the men at the dock warned me about them, and even told me how to locate them, by the peculiar ripple of the shallow water over them. But I forgot all about it. Oh, dear!" "Well, it can't be so very bad," spoke Molly, who was idly splashing the water with one hand. "We can't sink. That's a consolation." "Don't do that!" exclaimed Amy quickly. She had cuddled closer to Betty, following the shock as the boat came to a stop on the concealed bar. "Don't do what?" asked Molly wonderingly. "Put your hand in the water. There may be alligators, you know. I'm not sure, but I think I saw something like the head of one a moment ago." Molly pulled in her hand so suddenly that she flirted a little shower of drops on all in the boat. "Stop it, you mean thing!" cried Grace. "Oh, I beg your pardon," spoke Molly with elaborate politeness. "I didn't think your sailor suit would spot. Mine doesn't." "It isn't that. No, indeed. I meant Amy for bringing up such a topic as alligators at this moment when we can't move. And the ugly creatures always come out on a sandbar to sun themselves, don't they?" "Not on this sandbar," asserted Betty. "It's under water. If it had been out, I should have seen it." "I'm sure I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, Grace," said Amy humbly, "but really I did not think it was safe for Molly to put her hand in the water." "Of course it wasn't, you dear," soothed Molly, patting Amy softly on the shoulder. "I wasn't thinking of what I was doing." "And I didn't mean anything either," added Grace, thinking that perhaps she and Molly had not treated Amy with just the deference due a hostess, for Amy did figure in that role. "Oh, that's all right," said Amy, with a smile that seemed always full of warm fellowship and feeling. "I know just how you feel." "Well, I feel wretched. There's no denying that," spoke Betty, with a sigh. "To think that I should run you girls on a sandbar almost on our first trip. Isn't it horrid?" "Well, we'll forgive her if she'll run us off again, won't we, girls?" asked Grace, searching among the cushions. "Here it is," said Amy, with another of her calm smiles, as she produced the box of candy for which Grace was evidently searching. "Thanks. Well, Betty, are you going to get forgiven?" "Which means, am I going to get you off this bar? Well, I'm going to do my best. Wait until I have a look at the engine." "What's the matter with it?" asked Molly, quickly, a new cause for alarm dawning in her mind. "Nothing, I hope," replied Betty, "but we ran on the bar so suddenly that it may be strained from its base." "Is it a baseball engine?" asked Grace languidly. She seemed to have recovered her composure now. Whether it was the fact of her chocolates being safe, or that there was no immediate danger of sinking, or that no alligators were in sight, was not made manifest, but she certainly seemed all right again. "It's enough of a ball game to have a base, and to be obliged to hold it," said Betty, with a smile, as she bent over the machinery, testing the bolts and nuts that held the motor to the bottom of the boat. "I guess it's all right," she added, with a sigh of relief. "Now, to see if it will operate. But first, I think we'd better see if we can push ourselves off with the oars and boat hook," for Betty, knowing that the best of motors may not moat at times, carried a pair of long sweeps by which the gem could laboriously be propelled in case of a breakdown. There was also a long hooked pole for landing purposes. "Molly, you take one of the oars, and I'll use the other," directed Betty, for she realized that she and the French girl were stronger than the others. "We'll let Grace and Amy use the hook. Then, if we all push together, we may get off without further trouble. If that won't answer, we'll try reversing the engine." The machinery had been shut down by Betty immediately following the sudden stop on the bar. About the stranded craft swirled the muddy river. Bits of driftwood, logs, and sticks floated down, and sometimes there was seen what looked to be the long, knobby nose of an alligator, but the girls were not sure enough of this, and, truth to tell, they much preferred to think of the objects as black logs or bits of wood. It was much more comforting. "Are you all ready?" asked the Little Captain, as she took her place on one side, well up in the bow, Molly taking a similar position on the other side. Each held one of the long oars. "Wait a minute," begged Grace, looking for something on which to cleanse her hands of the brown smudge of chocolate. "This candy is so sticky." "There's the whole river to wash in," said Molly. "Water, water everywhere. And not any solid enough to go ashore on," she concluded with a laugh. "I'll never dip my hands in this water, not until I can see bottom," declared Grace, finally selecting a bit of rag that Betty used to polish the brass work of the engine. "As if it would hurt to take hold of the boat hook with chocolate fingers," spoke Molly a bit sharply. "At any rate, one could wash the pole without fear of its being nipped by an alligator." "Don't be silly," directed Grace, with flashing eyes. "Well, don't eat so much candy, then." "Come, girls, if we're going to get off the bar, it's time we tried it," suggested Betty, with a smile. She did not want the two tempers, that seemed often on the verge of striking fire one from the other, to kindle now. There was enough of other trouble, she reasoned. The oars and pole were thrust into the water ahead of the boat. Bottom was found within a few inches, showing how shallow was the stream over the bar. The prow of the gem seemed to have buried itself deeply in it. They pushed and pushed again, but the only noticeable effect was the bending of the slender pole of the boat hook on which Grace and Amy were shoving with all their strength. The motorboat did not budge. "Once more," cried Betty. "I think it moved a little." "I wish I could think so," panted Molly, as she shifted the position of her oar. Again they all bent to the task, and Amy and Grace, combining their strength on the pole, caused it to bend more than ever. "Stop!" cried Betty in some alarm. "It will break, and I don't know where I can get another. We'd better try reversing the engine." She sat down in the cushioned cockpit, an example followed by the others. They were breathing rather hard, and presently Betty went into the cabin and came out with some iced orangeade that had been put aboard in a vacuum bottle to retain its coolness. "Here," she invited, "let's refresh ourselves a bit. I can see that we are going to have trouble." "Trouble?" queried Amy, looking at her chums. "Yes, we aren't going to get off as easily as I thought." "Do you think we'll ever get off?" asked Grace. "Of course we will," declared Betty promptly. "I'll never wade or swim ashore, not with the river full of such nasty alligators," announced Grace. "Wait until you're asked," cried Molly. "I'm sure we can get off when the motor is reversed." "The propeller seems to be in deep water," spoke Betty, taking an observation over the stern. "Come back here, girls, and sit down." "It's more comfortable here," objected Grace languidly. "In fact, if it were not for the fact of being stranded, I should like it here." The cockpit was covered by an awning which kept off the hot rays of the sun, and the cushions, as Grace said, were very comfortable. "But I want to get all the weight possible in the stern," Betty insisted. "That will raise the bow." Understanding what was required of them, the girls moved aft and perched on the flat, broad deck, while Betty went to start the motor and slip in the reverse clutch. The engine seemed a bit averse to starting at first, and for a few seconds Betty feared that it had suffered some damage. But suddenly it began to hum and throb, gaining in momentum quickly, as it was running free. Betty slowed it down at the throttle, and then, looking aft to see that all was clear, she slipped in the clutch that reversed the propeller. There was a smother of foam under the stern of the Gem, which trembled and throbbed with the vibration. Betty turned on more power until finally the maximum, under the circumstances, was reached. "Are we moving?" she called anxiously to her chums. "Not an inch," answered Molly, leaning over to look at the surface of the water. "Not an inch." "We'll try it a little longer," said Betty. "Sometimes it takes a little while to pull loose from the sand." "Suppose some of us go up in the bow and push," suggested Molly. "That may help some." "Perhaps, and yet I want to keep the bow as light as possible, so it won't settle down any more in the sand." "I'll go," volunteered Molly. "One can't make much difference, and I am not so very heavy." "All right," agreed Betty. With one of the oars, Molly pushed hard down into the holding sand, while Betty kept the motor going at full speed reversed. But the Gem seemed too fond of her new location to quit it speedily, and the girls, looking anxiously over the side, could see no change in their position. "It doesn't seem to do any good," wailed Betty, hopelessly, as she slowed down the engine. The water about the craft was very muddy and thick now, caused by the propeller stirring up the bottom of the river. "I guess we'll have to wade or swim ashore," said Amy, in what she meant to be a cheerful voice. "Never!" cried Grace. "I'll stay here until someone comes for us. Say, we haven't called for help," she exclaimed with a sudden thought. "We're not so far from either shore but what we could make ourselves heard. I think let's give a good call." "That's so," agreed Molly. "I never thought of that." The girls looked across to the distant shores. True enough, the banks were not far off, too far to wade or swim, perhaps, but as the day was calm, and still their voices might possibly carry. "There doesn't seem to be much of a population on either side," observed Betty grimly. "Still, there may be houses back from the shore, hidden by the trees. Now, all together." They raised their fresh young voices in a combined call that certainly must have carried to both shores. Then they waited, but nothing happened. Again they called, and again, several times. "I'll give the first man who comes for us in a boat all the chocolates I have left," bribed Grace. No one appeared to accept. Again they called, after a little rest, and a sipping of what remained of the orangeade, but to no purpose did their appeals for aid float across the stretch of muddy water. Once more Betty tried reversing the engine, and again the girls pushed with the oars and pole. The Gem remained fast on the sandy bar. "I wonder how it would do if I got out and dug around the bow," suggested Betty. "The water is shallow on the bar, hardly over my ankles." "Don't you do it!" cried Grace. "Those horrid—" "Hark!" cried Molly, with upraised hand. "I hear something." Through the stillness they could all note the regular staccato puffing of the exhaust of a gasoline motor. It drew nearer. "It's a boat coming!" cried Betty. A moment later a motor craft swung into view around an upper bend, coming swiftly down the river. But at the sight of it the girls gave a gasp, for it was filled with roughly dressed colored men, while in the stern sat a white man of even more villainous appearance than the blacks. And the boat was headed straight for the stranded Jem. Help was coming indeed, but it was of doubtful quality. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Outdoor Girls in Florida by Laura Lee Hope. Chapter 11. Into the Interior. "Oh, dear!" cried Grace as she shrank back against Betty. "Oh, dear!" Those men," breathed Amy, who also seemed to be looking about for some sort of physical support. "See, Betty?" They both seemed to depend on the little captain in this emergency. As for Molly, her dark eyes flashed, and she looked at Betty with a nod of encouragement. Whatever happened, these two would stand together at any rate. "Don't be silly!" exclaimed Betty, stilling the wild beating of her own heart by the reflection that she must be brave for the sake of others. "But they are coming right toward us," gasped Grace, making a move as though to hide in the cabin. "Of course they are!" exclaimed Molly quickly. "They are going to help us, aren't they, Betty?" "I'm sure I hope so," was the low-voiced answer. "One thing, girls, speak very carefully. Sound carries very distinctly over water, you know." "They are coming toward us," added Amy, shrinking closer to Betty. There was no doubt of that. The eyes of all in the approaching motorboat, which was a powerful craft, were fixed on the girls in the Gem, and it was a strange sight to see the eyes of the colored men, with so much of the white showing in contrast to their dark faces, staring fixedly at our friends. Grace caught herself in a half-hysterical laugh. "They looked just like those queer China dolls," she explained afterward. The white man steering the boat was almost as dark in complexion as were his companions, but at least he was white. The girls were sure of that. "I guess they know we have run on a sandbar," Betty explained, in as calm a voice as she could bring to her need. "They are avoiding it themselves." As she spoke, the other boat made a wide sweep, and then, having gone down past the Gem, it again swept in on a curve, now being headed upstream. "Stuck?" called the white steersman, and his voice was not unpleasant, though a bit domineering, Betty thought. But perhaps this is because he is used to giving orders, she reflected. "Yes, we are on a sandbar, I'm afraid," she answered and smiled. "Look natural," she commanded to the others a moment later, her voice not reaching the men in the other craft, she felt sure, for the clutch of the relief boat had been thrown out, and the engine was racing, making considerable noise. "Look as though we expected this," Betty commanded. "There's nothing to fear. We are not far from home." "Lots of folks get stuck on that bar," went on the man, who was bringing his boat into a position favorable for giving aid to the Gem. "It ought to be buoyed or marked in some way. You're strangers around here, I take it," he went on. "Yes, from Mr. Stonington's orange grove," said Betty simply. "If you will kindly pull us off this bar, we will gladly pay you for your trouble." Was it fancy, or did Betty detect fierce and eager gleams in the eyes of the colored men? "Oh, shucks!" exclaimed the steersman quickly. "I've pulled lots of bigger boats than yours off that bar, and not for pay neither. Can you catch a rope?" "Oh, yes," said Molly quickly, determined to second Betty's efforts to appear at ease. "We've done considerable cruising." "That's good. Well, you want to know this river before you do much more. It's treacherous. Sam, throw that rope while I put us up a little closer," he commanded. "Yes, boss," was the reply of a big colored man in the bow. Both Molly and Betty grasped for the rope as it came uncoiling toward them. "That's good," complimented the man. "Now, can you make it fast? Have you a ring bolt there?" "No, but there's a deck cleat," spoke Betty. "Just the same. Now then, I'm going to turn about and try to haul you off, pointing my bow downstream. This boat works better on the direct clutch than in reverse, and when I start to pull, you'd better reverse your motor. Can you do it?" "Oh, yes," answered Betty. "Good. You do know something about boats, so you're from the Orange Grove, eh? I heard the new owner had come on. Need any men down there?" And he seemed quite businesslike. I don't know," faltered Betty, looking at Amy. "Mr. Stonington hasn't told us anything about that. This is his niece," and she nodded at Amy. "Oh, is that so? Well, if he should happen to need any pickers, I can supply 'em. Hank Belton is my name. I supply laborers for lots of orange growers and others. I'm the biggest dealer in labor around here. Ain't I, boys?" And he appealed to the colored men. "Dat's what you am, boss," exclaimed one with a chuckle. "And I always treats my help right, no matter what happens after they hire out, don't I, boys?" "Sure," came in a chorus. "So just remind Mr. Stonington about me," the man went on, with what he evidently meant for a friendly smile, but which made the girls shudder. "My place is at Pembroke, about 10 miles up the river. Now, then, have you that rope fast?" "Yes," answered Betty. "Get ready, then. I'm going to pull you. And start your motor as soon as the tow rope gets taut." "All right," answered Betty, in businesslike tones. The tow rope straightened out as the other motorboat started downstream. Betty watched, and when she thought the proper time had come, she started her motor on the reverse. For a moment it seemed that, even with this, the gem would not come off the bar, and the girls looked anxiously over the side to detect the first motion. Then there came a quiver to the stranded boat, and a shout from the colored men. "She's moving, boss!" "Turn on a little more gas," cried the steersman to Betty. "I think we have her now." She speeded up her motor, and in another instant the gem came free so suddenly that there was danger of a collision. "Shut down!" called Hank Belton quickly. "You're all right now." Betty turned off the power, and Molly cast loose the tow rope. "Thank you very much," she called to the man. "I wish you would let us pay you," added Betty. "Nary a pay, miss," was his answer. "I'm glad I could help you. Just give my message to Mr. Stonington, and I'll be obliged to you. Better back down a bit before you turn. That bar sticks out a ways. It's a wonder you didn't hit it before. You can't draw much." "We don't," answered Betty. The other boat was proceeding downstream now, the colored men looking back with their rolling eyes. Betty started her engine on the reverse again, and then, feeling sure that they were beyond the bar, she turned and steered her craft back toward the orange grove. The picnic plan was given up now, as it was getting late and the girls were tired. "Thank goodness that's over!" exclaimed Grace with a sigh of relief. "Oh, I was so frightened!" "At what?" asked Molly. I don't know." "Well, it was very kind of them," said Betty. "We might have had to stay there a long time." "And I'm going to tell Uncle Stonington," spoke Amy. "He may want to hire men, for there are many more oranges to pick." Grace sat thoughtfully on the cushions, neglecting even to eat her chocolates. "A penny for your thoughts," offered Betty. "I was just wondering," said Grace slowly, "that perhaps that man might know something of the labor contractor who has Will in the toils. I wish I had thought to ask." "That's so!" cried Molly. "But we can find him again. It will give us something to do, Betty. We can come up the river again." "And I'll be sure to keep away from that sandbar," declared the little captain. Mr. and Mrs. Stonington were quite alarmed when the girls told of their adventure. "They weren't in any real danger," declared Mr. Hammond, the overseer. "The river isn't deep nor swift, and there are boats going up and down quite often." "But what about those rough men?" asked Mrs. Stonington. "Oh, rough is the worst thing you can say against them. They aren't really bad. Belton has the best supply of laborers around here. Probably he was taking those men down to Hanson's Grove. We will need pickers ourselves next week, Mr. Stonington, and I don't believe we can do any better than to get them from Belton." "Very well, Mr. Hammond, whatever you say." "And that will be a chance to repay him for his kindness to us," added Betty. "And perhaps we can get some news of my brother," spoke Grace wistfully, for there had come no word from those who were searching for the missing youth. "I'd like to go and ask myself," went on Grace. "Well, there's no reason why you shouldn't," said Mr. Hammond. "I'll be going up the river in a day or so, and if you think we'll hire of Belton, I'll tell him so," he said to Mr. Stonington. "Yes, if you like, Mr. Hammond." All right, then I'll pilot the girls to his camp if their boat will hold me." "Indeed it will," exclaimed Betty, "and you can tell me how to avoid sandbars." "Belton's place is a little way into the interior from the river," went on Mr. Hammond, "but it's a safe road." "Then we'll go," decided Betty. The next few days were filled with small incidents of little interest. The girls motored about and did some fishing in the river, catching a variety of specimens, few of which were pronounced fit for the table. But they enjoyed themselves very much. They wandered about in the orange grove, eating as much of the delicious fruit as they chose. Sometimes they took walks with Mrs. Stonington, who was slowly regaining her health. Mr. Stonington was kept busy seeing to the details of the business that was new to him. One night Mr. Hammond said, "I think we'll need those pickers tomorrow or next day, Mr. Stonington." "Very well, then get them. The girls can take you up to Belton's camp." "And perhaps I can get some word of Will," observed Grace hopefully. The trip up the river was devoid of incident, except that Betty nearly ran on another sandbar, being warned just in time by Mr. Hammond. Then they reached the landing where Belton's boat was moored. "That shows he's in camp," said the foreman as he helped the girls tie the gem. Then they struck off into the interior, not a few doubts tugging at the girls' hearts. It was very wild and desolate, the Everglades being